Hi, and welcome to this live reading from A Natural Passion by Tammy Mannersley, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. Wandering carefully through the spinifex-strewn sand dunes of Monrepos Beach, Dylan O'Day used a specially designed turtle-safe flashlight to guide his way on the unmarked track. The calming roar of the Pacific Ocean, the curling waves colliding with the golden sand, provided a soundtrack to his usual early morning patrol. He'd come to the Monrepos Turtle Center, just northeast of Bundaberg along the Queensland coast, at 3:30 in the morning, as he had most days for the past 8 years. As a part-time park ranger and a marine biologist for the Merchant Marine Science Center, located just down the road, Dylan had spent most of his time concerned with the researching and protecting the large number of marine turtles which frequented the globally significant site. That was until she arrived. He was supposed to be her mentor, he reminded himself for the umpteenth time. Yet it didn't seem to stop him from thinking about her. Her sweet smile, her astute hazel eyes, her passion for aquatic wildlife, which was one of the numerous things they had in common. She'd been the successful applicant of a paid internship, a 6-month hands-on course offered by his employer, Max Merchant, to help students interested in marine studies gain practical experience. She was off limits until the internship concluded. "You're 10 years her senior," Dylan scolded himself in hushed tones. What drew him to her? What made her so alluring? There were plenty of kind, attractive women his own age he could date, though none were as passionate about the ocean and protecting the sea life as she was. Most of them didn't understand his work. They didn't care for the odd hours he kept or his strange routines, which were necessary to help protect both turtles and hatchlings alike. She did. As Dylan continued his patrol higher into the sand dunes, a change in the familiar landscape drew his attention away from his conflicted thoughts. The sand around a flagged turtle nest had been disrupted. A tug of worry pulled at his gut. They couldn't have lost another one, could they? It would be the second this month. Shining his flashlight over the spot, he saw a well had been dug by something or someone, and the eggs were gone or eaten. He bent down beside it, putting out the sides of his khaki cargo pants to make the movement easier. Reaching into the empty nest, he brushed at the sand with his fingers, looking for traces of shell, a sign of predator attack, but he found none. The eggs, whole and intact, had been taken. Anger boiled within him. His hand shook as he unclipped the radio transceiver from his belt. Dylan stood, lifting it to his lips, and pressed the button on his side. "Attention, base," he said, doing his best not to sound gruff. There was a crackle of static as he removed his finger from the button and waited. "Base here." Brian's croaky voice sounded tinny through the device. Dylan was relieved it was Thursday and the elderly man was on duty. While other staff might have been distracted or sleep-deprived due to the early hours, Brian had adjusted to the unusual schedule and was always enthusiastic on the other line. "Dylan here." Go for Dylan. Go for Dylan." "I think we've been hit by poachers again." "Again," the older man parroted back, his voice in shock. "A flag nest high on the dunes, number 12. "Noted," Brian said glumly. "Geez, Dylan, we counted 130 at that site. The clutch of eggs looked healthy. We'd hoped it would be one of the most successful." "You don't have to remind me," Dylan replied, his tone taut but matter-of-fact. "We have to catch those bastards, Bri. The ecosystem will suffer if we keep losing eggs like at this rate." "Too right. I'm going to continue on patrol, see if I notice any other problems or things out of the ordinary." "Careful, Dylan. Who knows if those guys are still around." "Sure thing. See you in an hour for breakfast. Over." "I'll get Sandra to make it a hot one. See you at 6. Over and out." A smile tugged at Dylan's lips as he clipped the radio back onto his belt. The Australian summer began last month, keeping the weather hot and humid. Even with the warm days, a hearty breakfast of eggs and bacon was worth looking forward to after a long patrol. The coming sunrise lightened the sky and turned the midnight blues of night above the crashing waves into calm mauves. The line of the horizon began to burn with a warm orange glow. Continuing further along the sand dune, Dylan pushed aside his anger and need for retribution, stirred up by the ransacked nest. Instead of devising a way to harm the poachers if he ever found them, Dylan started another mental list of why she remained off limits to him. At the top sat the fact he had more important things to focus his attention on. They both did. Romantic flings, no matter how much he wanted her, didn't make the grade when there was illegal poaching going on. But what if? The damned optimist in him wouldn't give up, always going on about what if. He couldn't have her, he shouldn't have her, and he knew better than to hope for the impossible. The problem was it wasn't impossible. He knew she liked him, maybe not quite in that way yet, but there was hope. Maybe her feelings could grow, even become love as he loved her. His passionate Kira. It wasn't really wrong, was it? Technically, she wasn't spying on him. He just happened to be in her line of sight. Yeah, that was it. Kira Shine sat at the computer, going over the estimated predictions for the hatchlings this season as she'd been asked. Was it her fault the desk she was using happened to be on the second story of the Merchant Marine Science Center and also in front of the large picture window which overlooked the sparse green yard out back? How was she to know he'd planned to hose down the boat shirtless, even though he did it most mornings after the crew had gathered their daily samples and statistics from along the shore? Maybe this would be the day he wouldn't. He was, and boy, she thoroughly enjoyed watching him. His lean, muscular body was bronzed. It glistened with the spray of the water under the midday sun. Somehow he'd managed to get himself entirely wet. Even the small navy shorts, which ensured him some modesty, were slicked tight to his body from the moisture. He waved the nozzle of the hose in front of the silver hull of the small motorboat, his biceps contorting and bulging with the movement, making Kira wondered what it would feel like to have those arms wrapped around her. She shivered at the thought and then mentally kicked herself for it. Could she be any more of a lovesick girly girl? She was nearly 22 after all, well into grown-uphood, if there was such a term, and well beyond schoolgirl crushes, and yet that's exactly how she felt around him. He gave her butterflies in the stomach, made her all giggly, naive, and stupid. She knew he wasn't perfect. He had a dangerous streak of bad boy, but it didn't matter to her. She was smitten. He turned his head and slicked his wet, light brown hair back with his free hand as he glanced upward. His triangular jaw lifted as he glanced toward the window. The surprise of his brown eyes meeting hers through the glass of the window had her flinching. Her hand flapped to the side and knocked over the canister of pens on the desk, scattering them across the desktop. Kira snapped her eyes to the mess she'd made, and ducked her head to hide the fact she'd been caught staring at him. With her heart racing, she hurried to tidy the clutter before anyone else walked in. "Did you see a spider?" The familiar masculine voice with its deep velvety tones had her spinning around so fast in her swivel chair she almost toppled over. "Whoa, didn't mean to frighten you." He was at her side, helping to steady her. His strong, warm hand was firm on her bare shoulder. "Thanks, Dylan," Kira said, and glanced up at her mentor's handsome face. I wasn't expecting you back so soon." She ran a hand through her lopsided strawberry blonde bob, then tried to straighten her scarlet singlet before offering him a small smile. He beamed at her, his perfect grin brightening his face, reaching his blue-green eyes, making them glitter. Grabbing the chair at the desk beside hers, he took a seat and then shrugged. "I got tired of repeating myself to the police. I'm not sure what more I could say. I found the nest empty with no clear sign of the culprit." Dylan scratched absent-mindedly at the window, at the shadow of auburn beard on his square jaw. "Without more information to go on, they're handicapped. They've offered to have a car patrol the coastal roads throughout the night in case the poachers are getting in and out by vehicle. And they've suggested we start organizing our own rostered patrols in groups of 2 or more just to be on the safe side." Kira remained a little flustered by her friend's sudden arrival. Had he seen her? She hoped not. She nodded, her thoughts returning to the memory of the theft causing a churning in her gut. "Good idea. I really hope the police can catch those douchebags before another nest is destroyed." Dylan watched her carefully, his head tilting, making his thick, tousled mop of auburn hair sway slightly with the movement. Even though he was seated, he presented an imposing figure in his black jeans and gray t-shirt. He was a very tall man, nearing 6'5", and his bulky, muscular physique reminded her of a wild mountain man she'd seen on TV. Although big and burly, Dylan was a gentle soul, kind and compassionate. She trusted him wholeheartedly, but couldn't tell him about her infatuation. She knew he wouldn't laugh at her, but it was sure to be awkward. Even with her crush on someone else, there was something sincere and intense between them. Whatever it was, she didn't want it affected. Friend or something more, she cared about Dylan too much to risk losing him. Besides, until she understood her own mind, she'd keep her feelings to herself. Concern filled his blue-green eyes as his hand returned to her shoulder for a moment. He patted the tan skin of her arm, sending shivers down her spine. You okay? Sure. She heard the nervous lilt in her voice and felt the jitteriness in her slender limbs before her gaze twitched toward the window. Kira pursed her lips, then tried for another smile as she forced her gaze back to his, but it was too late. Dylan looked out the window, the attractive features of his face contorting in annoyance. Looks like the boss's son is at it again. Her pulse twitched at the gruffness in his tone. Had he realized her secret? She glanced at Dylan quickly, then followed his line of sight. Jake Merchant, son of Max Merchant, the owner and founder of the Merchant Marine Science Center, was still wet and shirtless as he offered the lithe blonde next to him a flirtatious smile. Who's that? Kira fought the urge to rub a hand over her injured heart. Dylan grimaced, then shook his head in obvious criticism. One of the postgraduate students from James Cook University in Townsville. They're visiting for the day, gathering their own samples to take back. He huffed as Kira nibbled on her lower lip, their eyes still fixed to the scene below. He'd better be on his best behavior. His father will have his hide, Dylan growled. He's already on thin ice. One final step away from losing this job and his cushy accommodation on the grounds. Dylan's face softened as his gaze returned to hers. Nothing for you to worry about, Kira. Jake's always pushing the boundaries. It's just a shame he doesn't appreciate the opportunity Max has given him. Kira nodded automatically, but felt the need to challenge Dylan's criticism. I'm sure he does. Although she was new to the small team, only having started her internship 4 months ago, she truly felt like that Jake, of all people, was someone she understood on a deeper level. She'd accepted that he had little bad guy in his blood, but he'd often told her how enthusiastic he was about doing the work and the research they were doing. You forget, Dylan reminded her. I've known him ever since I was headhunted for the senior marine biologist position 8 years ago. And all this time I waited for him to grow up. But he never has. Dylan's jovial smirk pulled at something in Kira's heart and had her returning the expression, even though she felt she should have been insulted on Jake's behalf. Is that why Max is making you a legal partner in the business? She did her best to sound nonchalant. He thinks you'll be a better successor than his son. As his dark auburn eyebrows furrowed, Dylan chuckled sharply with surprise. Where did you hear that? He shook his head, dismissing the question with a wave of his hand. Don't bother. I know the walls have ears. He shrugged modestly. I guess. Really, I think it has more to do with priorities. Max and I, we care about conservation, protecting wildlife and their ecosystems. Jake, on the other hand, cares only about himself. Kira frowned. She couldn't exactly argue with that. Jake could be, at times, a little self-involved. She guessed he'd been spoilt as a child, at least until his teens when his mother had passed away. But maybe being overlooked to inherit the business had contributed to his acting out? Seriously, Kira, Dylan said as he stood and rested that strong, supportive hand on her shoulder again. There's no need for you to worry. Max is good at smoothing any feathers that Jake ruffles. Everything will be fine. The corners of his lips quirked upward, and the concern on his face morphed into something more joyful. I know what would cheer you up. Max suggested we all go out for a day trip to Lady Musgrave Island again tomorrow. See if we can get some visual stats on the turtles out there. His news made her smile. She narrowed her eyes at him playfully. Do I get a turn steering the catamaran? It was a job often reserved for Dylan or Max, but she enjoyed it immensely. If she couldn't bargain for it now, she didn't know when she'd get a better time. He smirked at her, obviously impressed by her sudden change of emotion. I'm sure we can work something out.